Please open your Bibles to 1 Corinthians chapter 11. This is study number 10. We're talking today about church conduct. That's what the issue is. And what it's talking about is conduct when the church body or any group of Christians gets together to worship and be taught of the Lord. How do you behave? The first statement is going to be found in chapter 11, verse 1, where Paul begins by saying, "Be followers of me, even as I also am of Christ." He's about to give some instruction, and he starts it with that. Now, there's been people look at this, and critics of Paul and all that, they've said, wow, what a conceited guy. Be a follower of me, even as I also am of Christ. I mean, is he conceited? Is he self-righteous? I mean, just what's going on here? But you have to understand what's really being said here. Paul was taught directly by Jesus. Jesus showed him all kinds of different things, including how to behave in church and how to conduct oneself. So he simply says, the Lord taught me certain things and how to do them, and then I in turn taught you. So that's why he's able to say, be a follower of me, even as I also am of Christ, who in a sense taught me. That's all he's really saying there. This is not some great conceited, self-centered kind of a statement. In just a verse or two, he's going to be getting into some conduct issues that are rather interesting. He's going to be talking about headship and, of all things, head covering, as in hats on your head. And he's going to talk about that regarding being in church. And does that matter? And why is he bringing this up? Because obviously there's a problem in Corinth regarding this. And it's kind of odd to think a problem with headship or a problem with wearing hats? How could that be? Well, we'll see in a moment. Verse 2, now I praise you, brethren, that you remember me in all things and keep the ordinances as I deliver them to you. He first starts off with an acknowledgement, a positive affirmation. They do remember and practice the things that Paul taught them. Apparently not everything, because he's going to bring something up that they're not doing so well in. When he talks about ordinances, we're talking about precepts, we're talking about traditions, we're talking about the very things that Paul had modeled to them in their presence. They're doing many of those things, so he said, that's good. You're on the right track with those. But notice verse 11, or verse 3 of chapter 11. It begins with the word but. But by contrast, I mean, we see that all the time in the writings of Paul. This but. So we're going to see they have a problem nonetheless. They are following him, but nonetheless there's a problem. But I would have you know that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is the man, and the head of Christ is God. This is actually the principle that he's laying out now for what's going to follow in the next several verses. Headship, or the typical meaning here would be master, ruler, chief. There's an order that he says exists in churchdom, established by God. And we're not outside the realm of understanding how this works. In the military, you have a general, and then you may have a colonel, then you may have a captain, lieutenant, sergeant, corporal, private. I think I got most of them in there, though I wasn't in the military. There's a hierarchy there. In business, you could have a CEO, a president, a vice president, a CFO, a division chief, just all in some kind of an order. And we're not talking here, by the way, about how this plays out. Christ is the leader of the church, and he's kind and loving and all that. That's not his topic here. Paul has another issue, but it is based on the fact that there is a hierarchy established, and he states what it is there. There is Christ, who's the head of every man, and every man who is the head of the woman. So Christ, man, woman. It's just a piece and portion of a hierarchy. So that comes into play in this chapter. But I want you to imagine something before we get too far ahead here. Imagine you work for an ultra high-tech liberal corporation. Many people do today. You have flexible hours. You have casual clothing. That's the norm where you work. Everyone is addressed by their first name, including the CEO, whose name is Bob. Everyone eats in the same company cafeteria. They provide child care for your kids. I guess we're talking about Silicon Valley up in Northern California here. That's kind of an interesting change of how culture used to be in business. But even under those liberal kind of conditions, loose kind of conditions, do you think it would be okay for you to put your feet on your desk when Bob comes by? I mean, just think about it. I mean, you can call him by his first name. You can eat next to him in the cafeteria. Nobody's forcing you to wear a tie. Everybody looks the same, etc., etc. But would you put your feet on his desk or even on your own desk when he walks by? I don't think you would, because there's something more that needs to be understood here. So this idea of ordership is key to understanding what's going on here. In verse 4, every man praying or prophesying, having his head covered, dishonoreth his head. Now, this is in a church service, a church gathering, where a man might be given the opportunity to pray out loud or to speak out loud as prophesying. If he's doing that without his hat, if he's doing that with his head covered, it dishonoreth his head. Now, who is his head in the hierarchy? It would be Jesus. So for a man to stand up in church and to speak with a hat on would be dishonoring to his head, which is Jesus. Apparently they were doing this. Guys were wearing hats and women weren't, and there's something to that. There's a statement really from the culture that they're in. A man wearing a hat is disrespecting God. That's the point. In this culture, to remove a hat or turban or head covering would be a mark of respect for a superior when in his presence. It would be disrespectful to keep the hat on. Now, most of us have probably been to a ball game, and when the national anthem is played, what happens? Everybody's asked to stand up. I think they say now, everybody that can stand up, please stand up. I think that's what they say. And I don't know if they ask people to remove their hats, but I think they do. And if they don't, most everybody does. Why? It's a respect for the national anthem. If you've ever been in a courtroom, when the judge enters that courtroom, what are the words? All rise. And everybody rises, and the Honorable Judge so-and-so presiding. And then the next thing that happens, you may be seated. There's a respect and a cultural thing that goes on there. Now, in this culture, in Corinth, for a man to be wearing a hat in church was inappropriate. That was the culture they lived in. Now, are other cultures different? Perhaps they are. For instance, ancient Jews generally prayed and worshiped with their heads covered. Although it was not stated in the Torah, the Old Testament, to do that, covering the head was a sign of humility. It was a sign of reverence before God and acceptance of divine sovereignty. It symbolized standing under God's authority and was often even used as a sign to signify grief or piety. But they wore the hat to symbolize something different. So that was the culture. So then, in this culture, again, a man praying at church with a hat on is an insult or dishonor to God. Now, here's another thing I think to keep in mind. Why is it an insult to God? Well, it implies something. It implies that when you gather together, He is in our presence. He's not just symbolically being disrespected, but He's actually being disrespected, if you're not careful, because He's in the presence where two or three gather together in a fellowship. So there's really something to this. Now, an observation, the early church had a great deal of freedom, as we all know, because they were not under the law. Now, under the law, remember, it had all kinds of rules and regulations. do this, and don't do that, and that. It was spelled out. But under the new system, after the resurrection of Christ, in the days of the church, all of a sudden, you weren't under law. You were under grace. Or maybe you can even say you are now under choice. You can do an awful lot of things without being forbidden. You are free to do this and free to do that. There's no rule necessarily against it. But remember what he said back in the last chapter. Paul had said this. He said, all things are lawful for me. In other words, I can do all kinds of things because I'm not under the law. But all things are not expedient. All things are lawful for me, but all things edifieth not. So even though I can do a lot of things, it doesn't mean that I should. It doesn't mean that it's good. It doesn't mean that it's right. In fact, I'm free to do a lot of things, even certain bad things, which if I think about it, I should make a different choice. I'm free to do that. So we got to keep that in mind. Now we read the next verse. But every woman that prayeth or prophesieth with her head uncovered dishonoreth her head, for that is even all one as if she were shaven. So a woman uncovering her head and then speaking or praying openly in church without a head covering demonstrates dishonor, disrespect, and being submitted to her husband. She is openly saying, I'm not in a position of submission to my husband. It even goes so strongly here as to say that this refers to one as if she were shaven. Now, what was he talking about there? Well, to be shaven was either a sign of grief or disgrace in this culture. The cutting off of the hair is used by Isaiah, for instance, as a figure of the entire destruction of a people by divine retribution, Isaiah 7:20. But among the Jews, a woman convicted of adultery had her hair cut, with the formula, because thou hast departed from the manner of the daughters of Israel, who go with their head covered, therefore that has befallen thee, which thou hast chosen. So you get your head shaved if you have been committed in adultery or caught in adultery. According to the ancient man Tacitus, among the Germans, an adulteress was driven from her husband's house with her head shaved. And the Justinian Code prescribed the penalty for an adulterous woman. At the expiration of 2 years, her husband refused to receive her again, and she had her head shaved. So culturally, the shaving of the head, the not covering of the head, could speak volumes about certain things. So Paul says, in essence, as bad as a woman's head being shaved off, that's how bad it is for a woman in this culture to not have a headpiece on in the church assembly. Pretty strong language is what he's getting at. In other words, important. This was important enough to fill a whole portion of Scripture. Wearing of hats, imagine that. Now next he says this, in verse 6, for if the woman be not covered, let her also be shorn, let her head be shaved. But if she be ashamed for a woman to be shorn or shaven, then let her be covered. So in other words, if you understand this, then she ought to have something on her head. Now, it's been pointed out that this verse is hyperbole. In other words, he's exaggerating. In essence, he's saying, look, if you're not going to wear a head covering, why don't you just shave your whole head off? I mean, he's kind of being overly dramatic, you might say. But that's what he is saying. It's important. I've asked you this question before. I'll say it again. In the 1960s and 70s, why was it that men and boys and young teens started wearing long hair? Why did they stop getting haircuts? Was it just because they had no money for a haircut? What was the deal? It was really clear, and everybody understood it. It was a sign of rebellion. Can you remember, if you were that old, how angry certain adults would get when they saw young men with long hair? Why doesn't that guy get a haircut? It really irritated people because it symbolically spoke that he's not going along with the norm. He's in rebellion. And that's why they did it. There's no question about it. In the 1940s, go back a little bit further, 1950s, a woman wearing pants was thought to be quite immodest and inappropriate. That's not that far ago, 1940s and 50s. Women were not really considered wise or smart or correct to wear pants. It was considered to be immodest. Imagine that. So I looked up Amelia Earhart. She was a little bit before this. If you've ever seen pictures of Amelia Earhart, you see her with short hair and long pants, kind of khaki pants and all that kind of thing. And the question I had was, were people bothered with her dressing like that back then, even though she was, flying an airplane and doing all that kind of thing? And you know what the answer was? They were quite put off by that. They respected her accomplishments, but they were quite put off by the way she dressed. Why? Because it sure seemed like she was trying to look and act like a man. The short hair, the pants, and all that kind of thing. Symbols are important. And if we think symbols are important, what we're learning here is that God sees these things as equally important. You could symbolically do something to very much irritate and degrade your submission to God, in other words. And so that's what Paul is getting at. So the Corinthians were coming together in the church for whatever reason. Did they feel extra free? Did they really feel rebellious and wanted to show it? The women were going without head covering. Guys were putting head covering on. What a crazy thing. Just switching positions almost. And so Paul caught that, and I'm sure he recognized it's more than just a hat. Somebody could say, well, you know what? It's just a hat. Who cares about a hat? Well, nobody really cares about a hat until it makes a statement. That's how it works. And it can change over time. A few years back, I think all of us remember this. People began to wear the red, white, and blue flag of our country as a clothing. Making it into shirts, remember that? Making it into hats. Now, it's pretty common today to wear red, white, and blue, stars, stripes, all kinds of things, especially on the 4th of July. But not too far back, to take the flag and to basically turn it into clothing and wear it was considered to be what? Desecrating the flag. Now we don't think of it at all. So times have moved along. We're not too bothered with, most of the time, women wearing pants, okay? There's a lot of things that we're not bothered with anymore, and it doesn't seem to make the same statement that it did. But then and there, these were very clear statements. And Paul looked at that fellowship and he said, something is wrong with you doing that. And you are insulting God in the process of it. I showed you how to do things, and you're doing a lot of things right, but this is not right. But he goes on here. He says in verse 7, for a man indeed ought not to cover his head. And here's the reason why. For as much as he is the image and glory of God, but the woman is the glory of man. So the man, Paul says, represents God's glory in the church. So he does not wear a head covering. That's what he says it means for a man not to wear a head covering. He is portraying the fact that he is submitted to his head, which is Christ, by not wearing a head covering. Now, on the other hand, the woman represents the glory and headship of her husband, and the proper way to exhibit that is for her to wear a head covering. So that's the pattern. Now, he says here that man is the image and glory of God. What is he getting at there? Well, if we go back to creation in the book of Genesis, at the creation we note this, that man was made, it says, in the image of God. It's quite a statement. And we could probably spend a lot of time trying to decide what that means. But the statement stands. Man was made in the image of God. That was Adam. And he did not have a wife at first. But then we see the woman was made out of the man. Now, in Hebrew thinking and biblical thinking, what comes first has precedence. For instance, Abraham is considered the father of faith because he was the first in a lineage of faithful people. If you consider the Hebrew people today, because Abraham was the first, he is the highest ranking. He was high ranking because he was first. That's the logic of this. Another way somebody else put it, though, is this. Man is also God's vice regent in this lower world by the authority which he has received from his master, the Lord. So all these things are represented by certain symbolic things. Now, God has set things in order, a position, right from the beginning. And of course, symbols are very, very important in that respect. They are important to God. Some people say, well, I don't care about symbols. Well, you may not care about symbols. Maybe they didn't care about symbols, but God does. God cares about symbols. We're going to see next week, we're going to get into communion, the bread and the wine. They are symbols. Does God care about those symbols? Deeply, he cares about those symbols. So God is very much into symbols because they speak and they say things. And so when a symbol is presented, do we agree with God or do we rebel against God? What does it say? We go on here, though, in verse 8 and 9. It says, for the man is not of the woman, but the woman of the man. Neither was the man created for the woman, but the woman for the man. So in the creation, man was created first. So in Hebrew logic, biblical logic, who has that position of headship over the other ones that would follow? The first has headship over those that follow. It is stated here, the woman was created for the man. Note this, if you will, carefully in verses 8 and 9. That point is stated twice in 2 verses. When the Bible ever says anything twice, let alone in 2 adjacent verses, it's a very important topic in the mind of God. So the woman was created for the man. So the question would become, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, if we were to go to a Bible study and gather some people together on a Friday night and say, hey, let's just have a Bible study on Friday night. We just kind of gather together. Nobody's ever really taught before. Nobody's ever really, looked at the Bible very much, but in good heart, everybody wants to get together on a Friday night. And they say, hey, let's start with 1 Corinthians chapter 11, and let's start with this first part here. Oh my gosh, it's about head covering. And so the guy that has the home where the Bible study is, he says, well, what do you think? And what do you think? And what do you think you'd get? Well, I think it's this, and I think it's that, and I think this, and I think that. Just everybody's opinion. What happens sometimes is we forget the fact that when we study the Word of God, we're not trying to put our opinion in it. We're trying to find out what God says to us from His Word. It's not, what do you think about verse 5? What do you think about verse 7? It's not that. It's what is God saying to us in verse 5 or 7 or whatever the case might be. So when we look at this, and I ask a question, is it a good thing or bad thing, all these symbols? It doesn't matter what my opinion might be. It doesn't change things. God has set things in an order. Christ is the head. The man comes next. The woman comes next. You can disagree. You can fight. You can do whatever kind of things you want. You and I cannot change what he has done. Those are different positions, different reasons, different goals. Now, it doesn't mean the woman is more valuable than the man or the man than the woman. It's not that at all. No more than as a colonel is more important than a general as far as humanity is concerned. But he does have a slightly different job, okay? So that's how it works out here. So twice, The woman was made of the man, the woman for the man. 2 verses in a row. And then he says, next, for this cause ought the woman to have power on her head because of the angels. So he's not content to be done yet. He now gives another reason why woman should have a head covering on in church. And this is kind of an interesting one. He says a woman ought to have the power on her head. That means a symbol of submission, as in a hat or a veil. She ought to have this on her head because of the angels. And then the question comes up, angels? What angels? What angels are we talking about? And here's the idea. The idea is that when we are under, or let me put it back this way. When we come together in a fellowship, the idea is this, that the angels draw near and actually observe us. Isn't that interesting? That they would draw near and observe us. Think about that. That's what he's actually getting at. Now, it gets a little bit more interesting, I think, as we go along here, because there's something more to be said. According to the traditional interpretation of the book of Enoch, which everybody in these early times was well versed in, there were 200 angels known as watchers that were tempted back in the book of Genesis by the beauty of mortal women who took them as wives and taught them forbidden knowledge, resulting in the birth of the Nephilim, by which reason God ended up sending the flood upon the earth. I mean, what happened? Well, angels were looking down upon humanity, and they were, imagine this, strange as it may seem, these angels, 200 of them, were attracted to physical women and came down and had relations with these physical women and caused the birth of these Nephilim, these half human, half angelic being. Imagine that. So now Paul takes that a bit further. He's saying there are still angels watching over our fellowships when we get together. And the idea is you put covering on to help protect temptation of those angels. Isn't that amazing? Very, very amazing kind of a situation. Now, churchdom has most of the time taken this to be a very typical, understood, important matter. It was only up until the 1960s that churchdom began allowing women not to wear hats. Didn't matter if you were Catholic, Orthodox, or Protestant. Women were required to wear hats in church. All the way for almost 2,000 years, women were required to wear hats in churches. Some churches, you can still see that this is a requirement. In some churches, it's just a tradition. I don't think they think a lot about any of this, but they still do it. In a lot of black churches, women wear pretty impressive hats. They seem to do it for 2 reasons. One is because of tradition. The other is to express their faith. And so that's part of what they do, and the hat is a symbol of that. So as much as we say, well, this doesn't apply to today, it's perhaps something we ought to take not lightly of and look at it and be careful, because if what Paul says was true then it would be true today. So we may want to be thinking about certain things there. I know that sounds very weird, but that's what he was getting at. Angels observe and have the ability to be actually tempted by the beauty of women. So that's why you wear a hat. Interesting. Whoever would have thought anything of the sort? Now he goes on here. He says, nevertheless, neither is the man without the woman, neither the woman without the man in the Lord. For as the woman is of the man, even so is the man also by the woman, but all things are of God. So now to kind of balance the situation, he does make it very clear, men and women are really in a sense equal despite certain places where there is a headship involved in a hierarchy. But as far as value before God and all the rest, it's the same. There's no difference. So God has set up order. He has set up ranks. He has set up authority, and it should be respected even in symbol, including, in this case, women actually wearing head covering at church, at least if the culture requires it. How interesting is this? You thought it was just about head covering and hats and all that kind of thing. Now, next he says this, judge in yourselves. Is it comely or appropriate that a woman pray to God uncovered? He's like saying this, what is your gut saying? If a woman goes into the church without a head covering, church assembly, not a church building, but a church assembly, and she prays out loud, for instance, with her head uncovered, what does your gut say? I mean, that's what he's saying. The culture, the traditions that you have, what does it say? That's what he's appealing to. He says, doth not even nature itself teach you that if a man have long hair, it is a shame unto him, but if a woman have long hair, it is glory to her, for her hair is given her for a covering? So another interesting point having to do with hair length and how it makes a statement. Now, generally in our culture, and probably most cultures around the world, currently as well as historically, women have had long hair and men have had shorter hair. And again, most people don't think about it, but it is a cultural phenomenon. Pretty much wherever you go today, women are going to have longer hair than men. There have been exceptions. There always will be exceptions, but the general rule has been women have longer hair. It's an interesting thing. Where does that come from? Well, it's a long-standing thing that probably people would be hard-pressed to go back and find out when it was established. I think what Paul would say, certain things were established all the way back at the beginning, and they've just kind of continued all the way through time. In Corinth, for sure, that was the cultural situation. Men had shorter hair, and women had longer hair. And to violate culture says something just like it did in the time of the hippies. The long hair was a sign of rebellion. Women not dressing like women and men not dressing like men was a sign that spoke volumes. What is Paul saying? Don't be doing it at church. It's inappropriate. I've showed you how to do things. God is present there. Angels are actually present there. It's more than just you coming together, talking about Jesus, singing a few songs, and all the rest. There's much more to getting together and studying the Word than just sitting here listening to a guy talk or listening to words read from the Bible. So now we have the last verse we're going to conclude with today. But if any man seem to be contentious, we have no such custom, neither the churches of God. So what is he getting at here? This is how it should be for you folks. If you want to do otherwise, you are not being free, liberated, smart, nor wise. You are being contentious and creating strife, and you're indicating what's going on in your heart by this outward rebellion demonstrated by how you're putting a hat on or not putting a hat on. Imagine that. So symbols are important. So we'll conclude there. Next time, we're going to discuss how to behave during the communion service. Is it important? Should we be respectful? How should we behave? And why should we? That'll come next time. Amen.
Amen.